do apologize for the technical issues that we started with, and I'm happy to kind of share with all of you today just some of the background of a human rights complaint. And really, what I've been saying at most of the workshops and seminars I've done for the last 15 years is that the first thing you always have to do is you have to kind of understand the landscape of the discrimination that's occurring. And sometimes you're a victim yourself, and sometimes you're helping someone who's been affected by a human rights conduct or complaint. So let's, this session is going to be fairly, kind of like looking at the Alberta human rights system and how to file a human rights complaint. And I think that if there's any like questions or concerns that anybody has, hopefully we can have a way in which we can have a dialogue. I was going to speak for about 45 minutes and then have a discussion with the attendees and see how they take the information and what's kind of steps that maybe they've done, and if they wanted to kind of add anything or add an experience, I can talk about what some of the solutions to some of the barriers or some of the issues that they've been having. So let's kind of start by just talking about the Alberta Human Rights Commission and the tribunal and the act. So I'm sure most of you recognize that in Alberta, just like in most of the provinces, or like all of the provinces in Canada, we have our own provincial human rights systems or ways in which we adjudicate, investigate, intake human rights issues that we've legislated that our society is going to protect all of its members in pursuit of certain areas of life. And so when you look at the Alberta Human Rights Act, that also covers some very important areas of life in which Albertans are protected from discrimination. And some of the things that people believe about, human rights in general apply, but some don't apply because they're not within the jurisdiction of our particular legislation. And so, for example, I'll tell you a real story about a complaint that I saw when I was legal counsel for the Alberta Human Rights Commission. So in my role, I was at the Alberta Human Rights Commission for about 12 years. And in my role as, both as an advisor as well as someone who is a prosecutor, we would see complaints. So we have an open complaint system. So you can file a complaint, but you have to meet certain, certain parameters and certain statutory, kind of grounds and statutory areas in which we can then accept a complaint, we being the Alberta Human Rights Commission when I was there. And when you accept a complaint, you have to kind of understand that our goal is to find a resolution as fast as possible to that problem that the Albertan faced, whether it was in employment. So coming back to the issue of areas, so the large areas are employment, services, membership, housing. Those are the large areas of protection. So, and it applies to all institutions and businesses that operate in Alberta. Mostly, like I said, we would be dealing with areas of discrimination in the area of employment. And the second biggest one is discrimination in the area of services. And those protected grounds are obviously where most of us are facing discrimination. And so you have to be really careful when you're bringing an issue to the Alberta Human Rights Commission that it falls within a particular area that's covered and a particular ground. So, for example, years ago when I was at the Alberta Human Rights Commission, an individual brought a complaint saying that they were discriminated against because they weren't allowed to or to take time off for attending their grandparents' funeral. So when I'm applying my, kind of my explanation to this, you have to remember that everything aside, if you have certain benefits at work or you have certain, that this isn't about that. This is about the complaint that they were discriminated against because they were not allowed to take extra time off as a human right to attend their grandparents' funeral. So even though they were asking something from their employer, they were perhaps asking for something that could be considered very reasonable in terms of maybe, if they had some special leave policy that was in place. The issue was whether or not by denying them that special leave were they discriminated against based on a protected ground. And so it's very clear in our legislation that unless you fall under those categories, you don't get to then have your complaint become accepted and then go through the process, which includes conciliation, which includes investigation, which includes different levels of adjudication, and up to a hearing. So my analysis that was then and even now is that a person who has been denied a particular leave to attend a funeral is not covered under the Alberta Human Rights Act. And I'm not, if anybody has any questions about what that means or why I came to that conclusion then, and I'm sharing it as an example now for us to look at the parameters of our legislation, I'm happy to address that. Unfortunately, like I said, the technology that I'm having right now is I'm not sure if there's an opportunity to have any sort of participation by any of the attendees, but I was going to kind of move on and then go to the stage of talking about a human rights complaint in terms of some of the steps that one would take in Alberta to have a human rights complaint accepted. So I'm going to give you now an example that I think we'll run with for the rest of my presentation today, which would be a person who is at work and, for example, is now asking or coming back from a paternity or maternity leave. That person is either, like I said, is asking or is returning, and has a particular conduct in which has affected them in terms of their status quo in their work. So I'm keeping it broad because I think it's important to remember that discrimination can occur in several aspects of a workplace policy. So let's say in this example that I've said that a person has a particular position and they've then requested that position remain open while they go on paternity or maternity leave. If the employer doesn't even communicate properly about what the leave policy is, or what the expectations or the return to work parameters are, that could lead to a very serious form of discrimination, because it actually is something that is conduct that affects the person adversely, and that would then be something that a person, even before they even go on leave, or when they're coming back, they could then engage their employer with respect to their concerns about their discrimination or their alleged discrimination, or they could even go to the Alberta Human Rights Commission and say, well, this is what's happened to me, and fill out a form that's online and file the complaint and then when they go through the complaint form, they could articulate the main aspects of what's happened. They have a position in a particular workplace. There is a particular protected ground, which is that they're they want to go on some type of paternity or maternity leave, and then the employer has a particular conduct which is or is about to affect them adversely. So all a complaint has to do is articulate those facts, and then in the form it allows you to check mark what your protected areas are, what your protected grounds are. And I'm sorry, I wish I had the technology to link the form as we're talking, but the Alberta Human Rights Commission website is very good, and you can kind of click on these and download these forms, so you can, if now you wanted to do that, you can see how easy the form is to fill out. The ease of the form is really then the issue that's really comes to people's kind of where they're saying, yeah, it's easy to file this form. I filed the form, but why didn't they accept my complaint? Now, there are many reasons why a complaint may not be accepted. One being that you didn't cover the proper grounds and areas, which means that there is no jurisdiction for the Alberta Human Rights Commission to accept the complaint. Sometimes your details are not enough to determine whether or not your human rights have been violated. So then the intake person at the Alberta Human Rights Commission may send the complaint form back for you to fill out more details. Sometimes you need help, and there's even help, like, for example, the John Humphrey Society does amazing with their human rights officers, where they can help you with making sure that all the proper details and the facts are in your human rights complaint. You can go to other institutions like the Edmonton Community Legal Center and ask to speak to one of the volunteer lawyers there, and they're very good at then helping you fill out the human rights complaint. So they can actually go through your facts with you in a confidential way and help you to file it. And once it's filed and it's accepted, you're going to get a response from the Alberta Human Rights Commission that they've accepted your complaint. They'll assign you a number, and they'll also then, if it's being filled out right, they'll also then send the complaint, the accepted complaint, they will send to the respondent, asking them for a response. Sorry, I'm just looking and seeing if anything has come up yet, but nothing shows up on my screen. So I do apologize. I'm not seeing any questions or anything. So even if somebody has their hands up, I can't see it at all. So I do apologize. So, pardon me.
Hi, Arman. Sorry, just wanted to come yes. So we don't have any questions so far in the chat. I did, however, drop the complaint form, the Alberta Human Rights Commission complaint form, for everybody to take a look at and just peruse along as you speak.
Okay, good. Okay, so perfect, Parveen. That's perfect, actually, because once you have the complaint form, some of my comments will be more. You can kind of just go through the form and see what I've been talking about in terms of what's required. And like I said, the form is pretty easy to fill out. And that's why I tell people when I'm speaking at groups, just fill out the form. You can even use that as a template to have that first discussion with family members or support people, or even nonprofit groups that are helping you fill out the form. Once it's accepted, you have to remember that it goes through an administrative process. So that's all statutorily, meaning that the legislation has certain steps that are required to be taken in order to meet what we think is, in terms of our legislation, procedural fairness. So that being said, the procedural fairness, the next step is there's twofold, right? One, it's the determination of whether or not there is an early intervention that's necessary with respect to a complaint, and that early intervention has three parts to it. One, it could be that the director themselves or the human rights officer designates a complaint immediately to then be to be decided based on some preliminary facts. The second is when the parties want the director to look at a complaint as early as possible. And then the third stage is whether or not it'll go to conciliation. And then the human rights parties, the complainant and the respondent, are asked whether or not they want to engage a human rights conciliation process, which also is mandated in the legislation. But because of the administrative procedure that is that the Human Rights Commission has implemented, and some of it has been implemented over the years to try to help people find solutions as early as possible, which is the early intervention. You have to really be careful about whether or not the process that's being being chosen by the Alberta Human Rights Commission is the one that best suits your particular facts. And so sometimes you have to have a strong preparation for, like, for example, if there was an early intervention with respect to jurisdiction, or an early intervention with respect to whether there is some other type of process, like, for example, whether or not it deals with a union matter, or whether it involves with a case that's currently before the court. There could be ways in which you have to understand how the administrative process of the Alberta Human Rights Commission works. And again, the better you understand this and prepare for it, with or without help from support or a nonprofit or lawyer, you have to kind of understand where you want to kind of, not where, but how much you need to participate in a more active way. So remember, no one is required to get their own legal counsel when they start a complaint. So I've often told people, like I said, look at the human rights complaint form, try to put as much good details into your complaint. But remember that there are certain criteria that you need to meet in order to properly get your complaint accepted and then moving forward in the process. Ultimately, if your complaint is clear and you have those details, it may be that the director, through a human rights officer or even through the human rights lawyers that they have there, will take a more active role and an active participation in your complaint. But remember, this is always your complaint. So at no time do you have to follow what the director says, or even the legal counsel for the director, unless they're making a decision which directly affects you, in which you may need to then look at getting counsel, getting other support, maybe even reviewing more details about your case and providing more documentation. Those things, and you'll be given a lot of notice. But what I've told to many people is you have to be cognizant right away that there is a lot of steps that you need to be cognizant of, which could then change the direction of your complaint. So let's talk about some of those things that will change the direction of your complaint, because ultimately this is a public process in which the government has instituted an institution which takes in your complaint, tries to mediate or conciliate it, may investigate it, then may ultimately prosecute it. But it is a very high likelihood that you will have to do some more work other than the complaint in order to meet the threshold of going through the human rights process in Alberta. And this is where I speak to a lot of complainants, making sure that they understand that even when your human rights complaint is accepted, there are a lot of steps that you may need to do some more participation, some more work. You may need some more support. And sometimes people get lost because they think that, look, and I had tons of people saying this, oh, Human Rights Commission has already found that my complaint is has merit, but no, it's just that they've accepted your complaint. It doesn't mean that they found that your complaint has merit, and I'm using the term that the law uses. Whether the complaint has merit depends on a decision of either the director, the chief to a certain degree, or to ultimately to the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal, which only after a full hearing can ultimately decide whether your Alberta human rights complaint is has merit and that there has been a violation of your human rights. So that being said, I think that what you want to make sure of in preparation for dealing with the Alberta Human Rights Commission process, you really need to make sure that you write your narrative, your summary of what's happened. You have to, two, make sure that you have all of the individuals that could possibly be witnesses or people that could give some background as to the conduct or the discriminatory acts that you're complaining of. And then three, you have to collect all of the documents that surround and can show that your human rights complaint has merit or that there has been a violation of your rights. Sometimes that means that you have to get your employee file. Sometimes that means that you have to make requests for disclosure that come during the process of a human rights investigation with a human rights officer. Sometimes that means that if your complaint has gone to the stage of the Human Rights Tribunal, that you ask for the disclosure from the respondent. Now, it's really important to remember that some information that you may not have, you can get access to it through you'll get it through one of three sources. One, through the response. So remember I told you right at the beginning, if your human rights complaint is accepted, you then will be able to see a response from the respondent. And in the case that we were talking about regarding paternity and maternity, it would be the employer. So the employer then is required by law to provide a response. Sometimes that response could be like very small, like very simple. Sometimes you're going to get a very detailed response with documentation, which starts the disclosure process. Now, the disclosure, so the second part of the disclosure process, which is very important in human rights, because many people, and I'm sure many people here who have worked in human rights have said, is that, well, I don't, I can't get the information I need to prove that I was discriminated against. Sometimes it's about, well, like in this case, it would be, okay, what's the policies that were in place? And what about, what's the rules regarding taking maternity, paternity leave? What's the rules regarding keeping your job open at a workplace? Those rules and policies and other documents like emails or something that would show that you've been treated differently, all of those documents you can and will get in a human rights process. It just depends on when you need to make that request. So for example, if you don't get it in the original response and you think there's additional documentation that will go to support your complaint, you can make the request with the human rights officer during the investigation stage. And you can specifically point to certain documentation. And under the Alberta Human Rights Act, the human rights officer has a considerable amount of statutory powers in order to compel a respondent to provide those documentations. And then the third place where you can get it is after a human rights complaint has been investigated and they've found that there's a reasonable basis in the information or evidence to proceed. Then at a tribunal stage, you'll be offered by the human rights commissioner or the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal member in a pre-hearing. They will go over the process of how to make a request and how do people exchange documentation. So, Parveen, if you can, maybe share with the group the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal procedural manual, because that has information about how to conduct a human rights hearing when it gets to that stage. So maybe I'll give a few seconds. If I know that Parveen probably has it access to it, but if she could share that with the group, that would be wonderful.
Yes, so I just put that in the chat for everybody to take a look at. And I think this is a really excellent overview of the process because, even with our work with Stride at JHC, that's usually the number one question that we get is just that opaqueness around how to actually move through the process and mechanism. But we do have a comment in the chat from Chelsea saying it cannot be overstated how challenging it is to determine who to trust while in the center of a possible contravention. So despite how many helpful supports exist, for those who do not know where to start, it's incredibly overwhelming.
No, and it is overwhelming. Look, I don't want to understate that very wonderful observation. But like I said, I think that once you're in the process and it's being accepted, like literally, okay, once your complaint has been accepted, it's very difficult for a respondent to take advantage so that you're tricked because you just don't have enough time. I think that, like, look, we have a lot of nonprofit groups that can help. And again, I think I probably at this time, I'm going to just kind of add in my email. Like if anybody in this session ever wants to have a chat about anything that's occurring to them, they can just email me at Arman, ARMAN, at forensic.ca. So Parveen, if you could add that for our group. Like, I don't want anyone to lose their opportunity to file a complaint because they're just overwhelmed, because we can, like, literally in probably, I don't know, like maximum 5 hours, I could do a really good complaint if the facts, and we know what kind of the background is, some of the fact pattern of what's happened to you at the workplace. If you have some documentation, it shouldn't take longer than 5-6 hours to kind of make sure that you start a human rights complaint. There might be some pushback depending on whether or not we have sufficient details, but it's very important to start that process. And I've told people hundreds and hundreds of times that, look, just get your complaint in, because if you miss a deadline under our legislation, it's devastating. It's so difficult that I can't tell you. Like, most times people fail if they miss a deadline, and so that process itself is overwhelming to 90% of people. So I'm encouraging people to be very proactive. when they face something, obviously look to your supports. I know that it's hard and it creates a lot of tension and pressures, but I can't tell you how important it is to really get that complaint going, and then use whatever resources. Some people have more resources, some people have less, but we really need to make sure that that complaint is in. So where I was at was, with respect to having disclosure and the three different ways in which you can get that information is very important. Now, basically throughout the process, whether it's through a conciliation, investigation, or even at the stage of the pre-hearing, I can't stress enough how important it is to make sure that you understand the facts and which facts apply to a human rights complaint. A human rights complaint in Alberta has certain parameters and certain relevant facts that apply to the test for discrimination, right? And I kind of wanted you to kind of understand that, and I've said it to you in a summary fashion, but there's a case called O'Malley, and recently there's the Moore decision, which outlines, the Moore decision from the Supreme Court of Canada is very good about restating the law about what evidence do you need to prove a prima facie case of discrimination. And so if, again, Parveen, sorry to trouble you, but if you could share the Moore decision with the group, I think it will give them a really good basis upon which they can look at the leading case law from the Supreme Court of Canada regarding how to look at the test for discrimination. And again, this, I'm giving you something in a very kind of like a straight 101 like manner. People obviously argue the issue of prima facie discrimination in multiple ways, but the Moore decision gives you some clear direction, and it can help you if you're helping someone to kind of understand how the law of discrimination is applied under our statutory regime or system. Many people, unfortunately, don't kind of understand some factors, and then they, when they're in the thick of it, they just kind of get lost. So I always try to tell people, look, just remember the principles of a prima facie case of discrimination, which is basically that, is there a protected, ground and area? Is there a conduct that adversely affects you? And is there something that links the conduct with the conduct that's adverse? And adverse is very broad, to the protected ground. So the protected ground being the conduct should directly affect your human right that is being protected, right? Whether it's gender or race or religion or disability, or sexual orientation, all of those three factors that are from the O'Malley decision from the Supreme Court of Canada to the Moore decision and other decisions are very important to recognize in terms of how you're preparing, even during the process. Because obviously some respondents take a very heavy hand in the process and do a lot of pushback. So in the human rights process, you have to be really careful about what specifically for example, if there is a decision by the director that they are thinking of dismissing your complaint, you have to know how to offset that or counteract that with not only a focus on the facts, but also focus on the law that applies to your particular discriminatory issue. So, sometimes you're going to need to do research yourself. Sometimes you're going to need to have the help of nonprofit or a lawyer. All of those sources are valid for you to then say, look, my case shouldn't be dismissed because of these facts, this law, and the application of that. And that, to me, a lot of people, when their case is dismissed, don't know the proper steps to take. And that is something that I think that you should know even at the beginning of entering into a human rights process, that you may never get to a full hearing. And that's sometimes very difficult for many people to understand. Why is it that they may not get their full, like, quote unquote, day in court? And there's lots of administrative law reasons for that. But but essentially, what I'm going to say is that, well, if you're not prepared to deal with ways in which our process can deal pre-hearing with your human rights complaint, then you're doing yourself a disservice. With our system, it could be that the director could decide that there is no reasonable basis in the evidence to proceed. They could also decide that because you've refused what the director considers a reasonable offer, they could also then say that we're going to dismiss your case because you have refused a reasonable offer of settlement. Now, it's one of the things, remember I was telling you about, it may be that the director's lawyer or the director themselves through a human rights officer takes more active interest in your case, either investigating it more or taking steps to try to find a resolution or starting to prosecute. So if it gets past a certain stage, the director will assign their legal counsel to prosecute, which I did for 12 years. You just have to know what that means for the decisions that you need to make and how you want to make sure that you understand whether or not you need to more actively participate. Like, for example, if your case is dismissed, there is an internal appeal process to the chief of the commission where you have to prove to the chief that there is a reasonable basis in the evidence for you to go to a full hearing. And you'd have to show how the director made an error when they decided to dismiss your case. So those two things, again, you have to decide whether you are confident enough, you have the facts, you have the documents, you have the support, or do you need additional support? But you have a very tight timeline. So that you have 30 days. And the good thing about the procedural process of the Alberta Human Rights Commission is that they actually tell you, here's the date that you need to get your request for review to the chief of the commission in. Here is the date. So you have to, that right when you've been served. Now, in some cases, I've had situations where the person has been unable, unfortunately, to get the letter. So you have to understand that in the law, based on the information you've provided to the commission, they can actually deem that you've been served, even though you can say, no, I never received the director's dismissal letter. So you have to be careful right at the first instance to make sure that communication is key. So in my experience, many people fail. For various reasons, personal and just their circumstance, that they fail to get proper communication between themselves and the commission. And so that, to me, is an absolute must. If you have any problems with communication with the commission, you should make sure you have a designate or someone like who's a support person or a lawyer. That is absolutely mandatory, so you don't lose a right. Because once you lose that right, it is very difficult to overturn it. And I want you to be really careful about that. I'm having a little bit of difficulty technically. If you just give me 10 seconds, I'm going to try to reset something. Hello, everyone. Just 1 sec.
Apologies, everyone, while we wait for Arman to come back online. But I do recommend that everybody take a look at the links that I dropped in the chat. Yes, Mark is also saying, Arman, we need your help. Very much so. Arman is incredibly knowledgeable and has a lot of experience both working with the commission and representing claimants through the process. But yes, yeah, I also do recommend that everybody takes a look at the Alberta Human Rights Commission's website. They have made revisions to it and sort of relaunched it this past fall after undertaking public feedback to improve its website. So, they do have updated resources that are available as well too. So I hope that Arman is back. Oh, there he is. Hi, Arman.
Hello, everyone. Hello.
No.
Sorry, everyone. I've had to move. I think I lost my bars on my phone. We're going down, and I do apologize for that. But
all good.
I hope everyone can see me and hear me, or is my voice is it off?
No, I can see and hear you. Can everybody else see and hear Arman?
Well, I can see now there's closed captioning happening, which is really cool.
Oh, great. Yes. Yeah. I think you might have hit the button that says closed captioning.
Hope that's okay. Or should I turn that off?
No, that's perfectly all right. But yes, yeah, I just wanted to let you know, Arman, that Mark has put in the chat saying, Arman, we need your help and can't wait to email you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. So look, so obviously, this conference is so important to deal with so many different issues. So in Alberta, we have a process that we need to engage. And obviously the report, Parveen, that John Humphreys provided shows a lot of the problem areas that we need to be able to provide input, but most importantly, we have to have our cases that are actually go past the system, and we can show whether it's extreme delay or lack of proper resources for people to file complaints or to go through the process, whichever it is, right? Because the process, unfortunately, is long, right? And my goal is to make sure that every single instance of human rights discrimination, even pushing the envelope, I mean, people should put their complaints in. We should have a process in which we can see what level of discriminations are occurring in our society so that we can make changes. And maybe there's new processes that need to be implemented, which is what I've always advocated for, even when I was the legal counsel for the Alberta Human Rights Commission. We need better systems in place that can give that assurance to all Albertans that their human rights are protected in reality, not protected on paper. So I'm gonna go to I think the last part I'm going to talk about for about 10-15 minutes is the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal process. So we kind of started off when I was talking about disclosure as the third area in which you could request disclosure is during the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal process. And it usually starts at the pre-hearing stage where after a conciliation has failed, after the investigation has led to a finding of merit. So I'm gonna kind of outline that this is the area in which the director has carriage, meaning the director will be directly prosecuting this human rights violation on behalf of you as well as the public interest. So if that is occurring, you still have the opportunity, because you are the complainant, to take any steps that you feel is reasonable to get your complaint before the tribunal. So it could be that you and your support or your advocate or your lawyer can also be there with the director presenting the violation of your rights. And so it's really important that you remember that no one can interfere with your rights because that's guaranteed under the legislation. So I guess one of the things that I can share, because I was prosecuting for 12 years, and I always wanted the complainants to have their own agency and their own control. So sometimes I spent a little bit of time educating, and you can ask questions from the director, from the director's counsel, from even at the stage of the tribunal. Even if you're self-represented, you can make those inquiries so that you can better inform yourself as to what you can do. And again, I think it's very important that you always maintain a healthy level of participation. And I think there was an important word that was used about trust. So every institution has to gain your trust. And it's really important that you feel comfortable. And again, with John Humphreys or with other nonprofits, you have great resources for people who can help you through the process. And even when it's frustrating, it's good to have that level of support. So that being said, in terms of the tribunal process, it's very similar to any type of court process. There is going to be an adjudicator or a person who's going to judge the matter, right? That's the tribunal member or the commissioner who's been appointed. And the commissioners in Alberta are now all practicing, for the most part, they're actually practicing lawyers. Some of them are in very specific areas of the law. It could be in administrative law. It could be in areas of employment and human rights. Some of them are in other areas, but their level of experience as an adjudicator is so strong that they're a great asset in terms of making these decisions that should be fair, should be neutral, should be allowing you all procedural fairness. And ultimately, you have to ask the right questions if you feel something is going wrong. So in the tribunal process, you have a pre-hearing. You're going to have some orders that come out of that pre-hearing that will be able to make sure that everyone is prepared and that there's full transparency as you prepare for your hearing. When you prepare for your hearing, you're going to be preparing submissions. So those submissions include your facts, it includes your law, it includes your analysis, and it includes a lot of prep, like the documentation that you're going to want to present. And then when you get to the hearing, the proper hearing, you're going to be fully, you need to prepare your witnesses, or the director's counsel will prepare the witnesses. You'll have to then give testimony under oath before the tribunal member, or you'll do it through a Zoom. So there's flexibility there. As you know, in the procedural manual that you've been shared today, there's a lot of great information on how to conduct yourself during that hearing and how to make sure that you get your story before the Human Rights Tribunal.
And remember, just like any hearing, because you're the complainant, you have to go first. So you have to go and prove your prima facie case that you were discriminated against. You have to prove that you have suffered harm and damages, and you have to prove that the respondent is the one who's responsible for that, right? And one of the things that you have to remember, the damages in the human rights setting is a very general principle of putting you back in the position. So this is the legal remedy that the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal can provide, is put you back in the position had the discrimination not occurred. So it's very important that you remember that that's quite broad, but in case law they've broken it up into kind of measurable aspects. Like, for example, back to our maternity paternity problem, if the damages you suffer is lost wages, then you need to show that and calculate that and prove that as a result of the discrimination, you have lost wages, you have lost other forms of monetary benefits that you had, and also that we have something called general damages, which is harm to self-respect and dignity, which means that we do also look at the fact that we, meaning those of us who are dealing with human rights, especially the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal member, will look at whether or not the particular circumstances led to a harm to your self-respect and dignity. And you can present evidence about how the situation affected you, affected your family. Sometimes you present medical evidence. Sometimes you can give evidence about what was your experience, and you can outline that with details about how you were harmed, how maybe perhaps now there could be a physical or a mental health effect on you, and then you can show with medical evidence, you can show with other type of evidence what effect this has had on you. And for me, that's one area which I think that we need to do more on. We need to show how important it is to recognize the harm that's being done when you are a victim of discrimination and the effects it has on you. So before I kind of move on to some of the other aspects of the tribunal, Parveen, are there any questions or any concerns about what I've been talking about?
So again, we have another comment in the chat from Mark saying that the culling process is extreme. We need to have a way of going back and forth more than twice. As well, I think, Chelsea, I'm not sure if you were trying to ask a question or not, but please feel free to drop it in the chat. But I actually had a question for you, Arman.
Sure.
So with our work at Stride Advocacy at JHC, we also help the community navigate human rights mechanisms. And one question that we get is, when you're starting off and trying to articulate your human rights complaint, often, discrimination isn't usually something that is so obvious. It can be something that is, for lack of a better term, a microaggression, or as we say at JHC, I mean, it's really an aggression. But how do you articulate that in a way that a human rights officer who doesn't have that same lived experience and may not be able to recognize that, how do you translate that then into a human rights complaint?
Well, okay, so Parveen, that's an excellent. I think we've been wrestling with that since the beginning of human rights in Canada. So sometimes, okay, so let's talk about the big two, right? The big two is, like, a lot of people started talking about overt versus covert or hidden discrimination, right? So some of that, I think that what I've recommended is, which is the proper way, is always we have to ground a human rights complaint in recognized patterns that we're seeing and in nonprofits, and you can see in social sciences, you can see with other types of academic research, we can see that there are larger systemic issues and larger recognition of human rights violations that become very difficult to prove. And before, maybe people were easier to, like, you know, like a racial discrimination case was much more easier to tell because people were more overt about their discrimination. But now people are, because of the obviously the implications, they're acting in a way in which you have to prove through multiple levels of conduct. So this, you use a word that's another type of phenomenon of microaggressions. So I tell people that there's two things that you should show with microaggressions. One, the harm that's caused by the microaggression, and two, you can actually show microaggressions as part of a pattern, like almost like differential treatment. And again, like for example, if in my example, maternity, paternity leave, someone tries to say, oh no, we're treating everybody equally. But if all individuals that are part of this protected group, like individuals who are taking paternity or maternity, are affected the same way, that doesn't mean that they get away from their discrimination. What it does do is it shows that there's probably a larger systemic or a larger type of group type of discrimination that you may need to articulate in a very particular way. So for example, if someone says, sorry, we don't have any more sick days for individuals who are pregnant, right? That could, in a very systemic way, in a very, you know, very in a pattern way, discriminate against, you know, women who are pregnant, and you need to show that, right? And so, again, like for example, with pay equity, there's a lot of those hidden type of issues that come up with gender. With respect to disabilities, there's a lot of hidden type of things that are done. So, you know, with respect to like, you know, some level of religious accommodation, people will hide behind questions of safety, right? They'll say, oh, there's a safety concern. Like, you know, I did a case with respect to an individual who was a member of the Sikh faith, and they wouldn't accommodate his beard. They were forcing him to shave his beard because they said they couldn't accommodate. But ultimately, we found an accommodation. I had to go to the Court of Appeal and back, but it was very important that we recognize how hidden discrimination works. Because someone could say, oh no, we're not discriminating, everybody has to wear this mask. And it's like, well, but the mask has a limitation. The mask is discriminatory. And it's like, well, no, the mask is the mask, right? And you're saying, well, no, if you choose the cheapest mask that you can, which clearly is discriminating against people who have a religious requirement for a beard, we're going to call you out on that. Do you see what I mean? And I'm sure even people here who are listening saying, well, yeah, the mask, what can you do about it? Well, if the mask and it's you know, and the policy behind the mask is like, we don't care about people who have beards. We don't care why they have beards. We're just going to implement the cheapest solution and not have any accommodation. That in it itself is so discriminatory, because that means that they've clearly thought about it, and they've clearly said we're going to discriminate. So but it's hard to get out there, because someone say, hey, it's not because he's Sikh, it's because we don't have a mask for this Sikh person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I mean? They leave out that they've actually had this discussion, they've had this thought process, and then they've discriminately discounted their duty to accommodate. So I was going to talk about the duty to accommodate, because it's such an important characteristic, even in like what you were talking about, Parveen, about the hidden discrimination and all of the difficulties that people face. I think it's very important that we focus on looking at all of us, no matter where we're in, whatever protected area that we have a responsibility for, that we have to look and we have to go out and say, well, how do we make this better? How do we provide accessibility? How do we accommodate? How do we look at new areas where people are being treated differently? And why is that? What are the barriers in our own workplace, in our own institutions, in our own, if we're doing businesses, what are those barriers that potentially could harm someone? So that question, I think, has not come up as much as I would like to say, hey, I'm brutal. I know that people think about these things, and I know that they're dismissive. They're saying, well, I don't care. I don't want this person of color. I don't want this person with a disability. I don't want this person of this sexual orientation in my workplace. That's the conclusion they make, but they see it with some other type of justification. And again, we can use our social sciences. We can use our other nonprofit anecdotes and the complaints that we should all be made aware of what's going on to have full transparency. That is what is going to change our society.
No, absolutely, Arman. And I think, you really hit upon that key point of accommodation that, it simply is just a matter of making that adjustment and not just, kind of allowing the status quo to remain in place and creating not just equal systems, but equitable solutions for everyone.
100%. 100%. So look, I guess that I talked a little bit about the duty. So there's two areas that I think we could talk about last before. I want to make sure that everybody understands that this is just like the 101 of human rights. Basically, what you should already get out of what I, because I actually say this all the time, file the complaint. Like, even if you don't like know for sure, file the complaint, because that's how things get changed. I know that from an institutional perspective, the Alberta Human Rights Commission will probably dissuade people from filing a complaint, but I think as Albertans, we need to really, I don't even think I need to persuade anyone, because I'm dealing with the limitations issue right now. And again, for a person who has lost their job and had to kind of suffer, for them to kind of then deal with an administrative law legal question before they can even get to deal with what happened to them is a lot, right? So I wanted to skip that part altogether, because literally I get 100 calls a year about people who said, well, I'm outside the 1 year period. Can I file a complaint? And I'm saying, look, it's too difficult to challenge that. So I'm not going to recommend it unless you really have very good reason. And different provinces have different, levels of what they will accept, but Alberta is very strict. So file the complaint. You'll never go wrong if you file the complaint like the next day it's happened to you, right? Look, I know that it's a year that we have, but doing it the next day isn't bad either. It's fresh in your memory. You get all the good, and whatever you need to put out there, just put it out there, right? So again, I was going to talk about two things. Like, the duty to accommodate is something that I think it's very, very important to recognize that those are very, very important issues that affect a lot of us in terms of our workplace accommodations or accommodations when you're accessing a service. There's a wonderful case that I think the director is taking forward about accommodation for those that have hearing disability. They're going to take it forward because many people with with hearing disabilities have a problem with accessing services. I'm hoping that within the next couple of years, we're going to have a better decision regarding what is the responsibility of our health services providers to provide a level of accommodation. And again, whether it's us assessing a proposed or an implemented accommodation, it could be one that's being proposed. It could be one that's already being implemented, but it could be like it's the cheapest option. Again, I'm not accepting that, and even the Via Rail decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, just because it's the cheapest option doesn't give you doesn't let you off the hook, right? Like, you have to have a real solution that actually helps people. So the last thing is that even like when you get a decision that's in your favor, that they find that your human rights have been violated, and here is the Human Rights Award, to collect on that is somewhat very difficult. And again, there was a change in terms of whether or not the Alberta Human Rights Commission will use their own resources to collect. So in about 2011 or 12, we changed, basically then leaving the complainant to pursue their individual damages remedy on their own. And that, to me, is something that we may want to encourage our government to look at again, because if it's so difficult for you to collect and enforce your human rights award, and it costs sometimes even more than the award is, it loses its efficacy, right? And so for me, the big thing is that people have to be made aware that sometimes, even when you do get a human rights award, unfortunately, you may never get it. Like, I mean, look, even when I was doing it, when I was going after awards, I would be very aggressive. But even then, sometimes if I couldn't get it, I would just say, well, look, I can't, we can only do so much before, if there's a bankruptcy or something, there's only so much we could do. And again, to me, look, the human rights remedy or the award that you get does make a difference in people's lives, and it could be devastating not to get it, right? But you need to be made aware that probably in 5 to 10% for sure of human rights cases, even when you're successful, you never see the remedy, like for the individual remedy. So in our last few minutes, I'm open to questions. I'm open to any comments. I'm hoping that Parveen, that if anybody else wants to jump in and give any sort of observations that they had, I hope that the system we have can do that. I can turn off my camera and just listen to everybody and see where we're at, or just take in questions from the chat.
Sure. Yes, yeah, everyone is more than welcome to join the stage as well, too, if you would like. There is a share button at the top of your screen. But we do actually have some questions for you in the chat as well, Arman. So going back to Mark, who said, we need a more immediate reporting process, Arman, because by the time people go through the process, the details are hazy. The University of Alberta protects political rights, Arman, but there are no protected human rights grounds to the Alberta Human Rights Act, and the federal government will not cover provincial cases. Do you think that we should include political rights and have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms become the main document by which to file complaints?
That's a phenomenal question. There is some overlap, but look, I'm of the nature that I look at some models in the United States. I think sometimes we have to split where it may be that the better model is going to be, like, for example, in the United States, they actually have a specific institution that deals with human rights violations in the workplace. I do think that that may be the way that we should go. I think that we have to switch up, and I think that we have to look. You've asked two different kind of things. Should we add to the protected grounds? I think that we should. Like, for example, poverty is one of the areas where I think it's very, very important that we see the harm that's happening to people who are in a lower economic bracket. We should provide those individuals with even possibly a separate type of human rights process in which we give them full representation, like full representation. Now, employment's another area where if we are seeing a certain level of harm, be it in gender discrimination, in racial discrimination, in discrimination on the basis of disability, we may want to focus on creating better workplaces. But it's interesting because there are, like, for example, I've seen other institutions trying to do human rights adjudication, like, for example, occupational health and safety, and even like at the Law Society of Alberta, we're trying to engage human rights protections. But to me, some of the things they're overlapping, and they may even contradict the protection. So I get scared when occupational health and safety is trying to make decisions on someone's human rights, and then say, "Hey, we're done. We've done a good job." I'm not sure if the nonprofits and the people who are directly affected by a particular human rights violation are actually agreeing with that. And so I think there has to be a system where we need to be more specific rather than try to bunch in a whole bunch of different concepts where people then start to argue about, well, which definition of human rights are we using? Are we using the charter definition, or are we using the definition that flows from the decisions of a provincial human rights statute? So I do think that sometimes there is a generality that we can talk about that, like, generally speaking, we have a lot more work to do in human rights. Let's just continue that discussion. But everything that we're saying, like everything that we've talked about, I think has to be really clear that all the hard work that, like, for example, the John Humphreys report that they made out, how do we implement that, right? Let's start there, right? Let's start with implementing 1 or 2 or 3 or all 20 recommendations, right? And but make sure that the people that are improving the system have the proper data and the proper perspective to say, because it's not, like, you know what I mean? Like, the John Humphreys and the people who did that wonderful report, if they're not consulted on the recommendations that they've recommended, that is from a lot of hard work, then it's kind of a head scratcher, right? Like, somebody says, yes, I'm going to implement better resources for human rights complainants, and the person who's suggesting that they've met that target is even not the person who did the research on the original harm itself, right? Because it's like, well, it looks exactly the same as before. And then you say, well, you asked me to look at it, I did, it's awesome, so I'm saying it's done, right? Which is comedic, right?
No, absolutely. And I think it just goes back to, collaborating and ensuring that in these spaces that, people who are doing the work are heard, but also that, that it's led by the people that it's impacting as well, too.
100%. Praveen, to your point, exactly. If the people who are actually the victims who are impacted and who are working it are not able to assess whether their research and their expertise is not being recognized, then that becomes problematic itself. Like, I'm not here to do it's not a PR campaign here. It's like, if we have a problem, like we did with, like, for example, we have an issue with recently the transgendered discrimination against the transgender community. if you're not going to ask the community and the members who are fighting for that whether or not changes are being implemented and they're getting the proper remedies, is that making a difference? We're not doing our job.
No, absolutely. I do want to just make sure we cover some of the other questions that are in the chat. So Chelsea has asked, they were saying that, so glad you mentioned duty to accommodate, especially regarding workplaces. I'm curious if you see the lesser known duty to inquire becoming more relevant around invisible disabilities such as mental illness.
Well, that, again, wonderful question. So look, I think with mental illness, what I've seen over my 20 years in human rights is most people deny it. I say, well, I didn't know. And really it means I didn't care, right? I didn't care to know, right? So the duty to inquire, like I said, I'm actually telling you that I know that people actually, like institutions, like on a big level, are saying, how do we avoid hiring people with mental health issues? And they implement policies which may seem neutral, but obviously affect people with mental health issues right away. And it's them saying, hey, I didn't know, how could I know? So it's I didn't know and how could I know? And literally, I think I start with, why didn't you know, right? Why didn't you know? What you didn't see what's happening in society? I'm sure someone in your family, unless you're extremely privileged or have no one but yourself, have seen the harm and the suffering of those with mental health issues. And so again, what we get a lot of times in human rights in responses is, I didn't know, and how would I know? And they told me something, but I just didn't pick up on it, right? Or they're doing something so odd that I just thought I'd leave them be, right? Like they want credit for being ignorant, right?
No, absolutely, yes, yeah. I think
so. Sorry, Chelsea. To your point, yes, but I think that I've told, like what I said, we have to make sure that we have our information right at the earliest possible opportunity, because people are going to then, try to get out of it.
Yes, absolutely, Arman. Thank you for that point. And thank you, Chelsea, as well for the question. We do have another question in the chat. Amina has asked, would you recommend filing a complaint for something like losing your job or being threatened to lose your job if you wave a Palestinian flag?
Well, okay, so it's really interesting that the context of workplace issues, right, is very, very important. So you have to first look at your policies in your workplace, right? Like, not to sound too harsh, but at the workplace, I'm not sure if waving a Palestinian flag is part of your work, right? So I think you have to, the question you posed requires a nuance about your work, your workplace policies. What, for example, again, if you have the need to engage some outside work conduct at work, I think you just have to look to your workplace policies. So one of the things that I've told people regarding the issue of any sort of if you wanted to make if it's an issue of freedom of expression or an issue of whether in the workplace, whether they were brought into a conversation which affected their human rights by assuming their position on religion, on politics, on anything like that, those things can definitely raise a human rights concern. Like, for example, no one has to engage you in a religious conversation. No one has to engage you in a political conversation. If you are being treated differently because of your religion, because of your ethnicity, because of your stance on someone else's ethnic rights, I do think that that could be discriminatory, but I don't think that it's fair for, like, for example, if an individual says that they have the right to protest in their workplace about politics or something outside their workplace, I'm not sure if that, like, I don't think that that would be a jurisdiction. I don't think that'd be within the jurisdiction of the Alberta Human Rights Act. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I do think that there's ways in which people are protected from them being the, you know, kind of a victim of some type of discriminatory conduct. But if their actions are not work related, it may not be a human rights issue at all.
Right. Thank you, Arman. I think that's also a really topical issue at this point in time. So thank you, Amina, as well, for bringing up your questions. So we have one more. Oh, Amina is saying, so not in the workplace.
Well, I think it's okay, so that's a little bit of an overgeneralization. I think from what your question was do employees have the right to do non-work things and expect the Human Rights Act to help them? And the answer is probably not, right? But if you are at work and being subjected to discriminatory conduct, which includes if someone is challenging you on your religion, on your position regarding ethnicity, around one of the protected grounds, then 100% that's protected. But I guess I would tell people that be very careful about what they're trying to say. Like, I've had many people ask me about freedom of expression in the workplace, and it's like, well, you're free to do your job, and the employer is free to ask you to do your job, but anything else could cross the line on several different factors, right? So if you are being terminated because you wear a Palestinian flag on your, I would wonder if there's a workplace policy about what you should be wearing, right? It's like some people asked about, like some people have asked me about wearing a yarmulke or wearing a kippah, like for our Jewish brothers who wear kippah, or are a Palestinian who wears the scarf. If you are discriminated on that basis, then clearly the Human Rights Act is going to protect you. Like, we're not in Quebec, which has instituted discrimination into its law, right? In Alberta, we have laws that protect you, but again, if you want to, I think the example was wave a flag. I'm not sure how waving a flag is even work related, right?
Right. Thank you, Arman. So we do have just one more question, and then I think we can maybe close. So it's from Mark, who's asking if the Human Rights Commission will not review certain evidence. How do we keep them accountable? Where in the legislation does it state they must review all evidence? And then Mark gives an example. We had a voice recording of discrimination with elements of arbitrariness in the prima facie discrimination, but the commission said that they were not doctors and could not make a determination. These power differentials are a large problem. How do we address this avoidance?
Well, again, there's three issues that I think that are really important, and I think I covered it in my presentation. So one, if you feel like there's documentation that shows that it supports your position on the prima facie case, you highlight it in writing right away. You make it part of the entire aspect of your complaint, right? It's really important that you show how this goes to one of the prima facie acts that you believe show that the complainant has been discriminated against. So to your second part is, when an institution is trying to use its own discretion and it's harming the complainant's rights, you make that part of your, like, you can make it part of your original complaint. You can make it a part of a response to an investigator or a human rights officer. You can make it as in your response to the director, and you can make it in response to the request for review to the chief of the commission. And that's where you would embed that power imbalance. And again, if you take an adversarial position to any of the steps of the commission, that's allowed, because as I said in my presentation, you never lose any of your own rights. Those rights are guaranteed to you. The director doesn't take away those rights. The question is, how can the director or the tribunal help you in your pursuit of that right? And remember, this is why I think it's so important to get your complaint in early and make sure that you understand whether or not the commission is also going to be assisting and how much assistance the commission is going to provide to you.
Well, thank you, Arman. I believe that we have finished all of our questions. So with that, I don't know if you have any closing comments, but this has been a really wonderful session and incredibly informative as always. And thank you so much. I know every time you come and deliver one of these sessions for us, we always learn so much, and there's always so much engagement from the audience as well.
Yeah, no, and I do apologize that it's been a hectic day. I've had meetings, and I remember I was hoping to get back to my office, but it kind of was like, okay, well, if I don't get online now, it won't happen.
No worries.
Look, my closing comments are this, which is how I kind of started: is get your complaints in, and two, I'm always happy to discuss what's going on. Like Mark's questions and I think Amina's question are very good questions, and I think that people should engage the Alberta Human Rights Commission as much as possible, because they're the funny thing is that I think they're only one piece of the puzzle of the larger questions of what real equity and change looks like. I think that we have to reinforce obviously JHC is a phenomenal organization that is helping thousands and thousands of people every year to understand not only the human rights processes, but also how we can all get engaged and participate. And so I want everyone to know that, look, if there's anything I can do to help, I'm going to do that in the context of trying to make things better for all Albertans, right? And I can't understate how important it is for all of you to get involved and do more, right? It's really important that we get ourselves all coordinated. But coordination starts with a human rights complaint, because that's what I mean. Like everybody, we should hand them out like candy and say, here, just fill it out. Like every day, everyone should fill out one, because I'm sure everyone sees something that's a human rights complaint, and we can fill it out, and we can say, okay, what's happening here, right?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I think just creating that record essentially then creates a database for our governments to be able
100%. No, and I think we need that database for ourselves too, because so much discrimination, like with looks, if you study like sexual orientation, so many thousands and thousands. It wasn't Delvin Reed wasn't the first person to be discriminated against in the context of employment and sexual orientation, right? And it still happens to this day.
No, absolutely. That's why it's so crucial. Get those human rights complaints in.
And share it with, like, look, I know that it's hard, and I know that some lawyers are saying, well, it's all confidential, we should keep it confidential, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, confidentiality is like, you mean for example, in the Federal Human Rights Commission, they won't keep any complaint confidential. They actually want there to be a public recognition that this complaint went through the system, there was a resolution and a recognition of the harm that was done, right? But like for us, we had a policy at the Alberta Human Rights Commission. Hey, if we can resolve it for the complainant and everybody wants to keep it confidential, we won't interfere, right?
Mm-hmm.
But look at the end where we may have done a disservice because people were feeling, well, I don't know if this is something I can file a complaint about.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely.
Right? And that's very important. And then they're going to, like, you know, sometimes people are going to say, oh, where's the data? Is this really happening in our, like, oh, is there really discrimination against gender in our society? I don't believe it, right? Like they'll say something so absurd that you kind of just like, wow, like this. And then they'll say, well, I haven't heard of any human rights complaint about this or that. And it's like, well, one, you're probably not looking. And two, not every human rights complaint gets publicized.
Yes, yeah, and there's so many too that are, I mean, rejected at the outset, that get dismissed, that never really see,
Exactly.
the light of day.
Exactly.
So there's so much
Exactly.
information out there.
Exactly. Like, what about the thousands of complaints that are just out of time?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right? They're out of time, and we're in a strict jurisdiction, and nobody gets to see that, and then the person suffers in silence.
Absolutely, Arman. Yes. Well, and we also have some comments in the chat. Chelsea saying you are a wealth of information and it's much appreciated. Alternatively, let's shout it from the rooftops and take it out of the shadows to reduce shame and fear.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
Exactly.
So with that, yes, I just want to say a big thank you, Arman, again for coming on here. And I mean, you know, shifting and adjusting and doing this from your car. We really appreciate it so much. And we appreciate you. You are an incredible human rights advocate and you give so much of your time to the community. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, everybody. You guys were amazing. And I hope to do this again and probably, hopefully, where I can be a bit more interactive. I'm sorry if I was. I know that it's my tech problem that occurred.
No worries. We adjust and we move. It's
yes,
good.
Of course.
All good. Yes, yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And please stick around. We have some more sessions on the main stage coming up at 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time and a film later on tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll let you all go. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Take care.